Okay, we'll move on. Next in our schedule is a brief welcome by Bruce Seeley, Dean of the Science and Arts.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really glad on behalf of the university to welcome our guests from industry and from government, as well as all the students and the faculty who are here. But the real person I want to congratulate for this evening is Posse. This is very much a product of his commitment to Rails. He has more than any individual made this go. That it is at 10 years is the best testament that I can think of to what Posse has been able to accomplish. And so I'd like to ask you to join me in a round of applause. For me, Rail Night is something that comes a little bit easier because I'm a historian of technology with a particular interest in transportation, including railroads. So when I start to think about this, I've been in Houghton for 28 years. And to me, the tragedy was my children didn't get to grow up around trains. And I think that, in fact, tells us a great deal about a story we could tell about American railroads. Railroading, and especially the steam engine, was the technology of the 19th century. Railroads drove this country in so many different ways. But the story of railroads was built not just around the fact that whether we want to look at the way it drove American industry into existence, where it was behind mining, iron, and steel, where it basically drove the creation of the American financial sector, because railroads required a mechanism to raise capital unlike any other business had ever done. And so the American stock markets very much owe their existence to railroads. American management always traces its role beginnings back to the engineers challenged with trying to figure out a way to operate a company that at that time was running across the unheard of distance of 100 miles. The challenges of communication, the challenges of information collection and analysis drove into existence American business corporations. But railroads were the technology of the 19th century more than anything else because of the visceral reaction and excitement of most people in any circumstance where they saw the steam engine in motion. Now, it followed even after we ended the era of steam. But nonetheless, for generations of Americans, the symbol of technology was the steam locomotive. But yet railroads provided other ways in which they are the fundamental technology for us to pay attention to. Railroads, in a very large way, first encountered the question of how do we make labor relations work, both in terms of skilled labor and unskilled labor. The challenges were often difficult, if not outright confrontational. But the challenges of labor relation, everyone eventually came to realize it's a whole lot better if you work with your people than against them. Patterns of American management also were worked out in large scale on industries. Something that is an interesting legacy is that of regulation. Because railroads were the first truly large industry, quote, too large to fail, perhaps, to use language that is out there in our world right now. But the whole question of initially safety, later on of understanding performance, later on of managing ethical performance in terms of finance, all of these things had to be worked out. Railroads, of course, were also one of the first industries to try to figure out how to operate through deregulation, a more recent story, but certainly one that's a pivotal part of the history of American railroads. So whether we look at what railroads are or what railroads were, there are a number of threads and patterns that I think follow through. Railroads today are much more about freight than anything else, which is where they began in many respects. Railroads are about efficiency. Railroads today are very much still an essential means of moving goods, not just on a continental scale, but on a global scale. The whole process of containerization that has emerged since the 1950s still very much comes to rely on railroads as a key piece of that particular story. To me, the really intriguing thing, though, that reminds you of if you're around long enough, things will circle back again, is the interesting conversations about railroads as carriers of petroleum. A story that has begun to emerge if you go a little bit west of here, and trying to figure out how to turn a technology that has served one purpose a long time ago, been displaced by pipelines, in part because of people like John D. Rockefeller thought it would be a whole lot better to control his transport system than to have to pay the railroads. And so pipelines began to take over. What do you do when you don't have pipelines? Ask the people in North Dakota. And we've got a story where, again, the railroads are driving a fundamental change in American energy, delivery, and policy. You'll be curious to see how all that plays out. Now, I was hoping, because we were led to believe there might be some folks who are visiting campus from Silicon Valley here this evening, but I don't see any of those folks. But to me, the way we pull things together at the end here is the way in which railroading is no longer just about iron and steel and energy. It's really intriguing if you look at the operations center of the half dozen large rail operations and discover the extent to which they run now on fiber optics and communications technology, in other words, on computers. Railroads were, for the American economy from the 1830s right up into the 1950s, that economy that information has become today. And yet railroads are one of many beneficiaries where information technology, absent a context, doesn't really make very much sense. So railroads are demonstrating, my final thought, better than anything else, that what it takes to remain current, to invent and then reinvent and then reinvent yourself again. This requires stepping away from what you think the industry is or has been and trying to imagine ways in which it will continue to serve the needs of society in ways that people can't quite imagine yet. But above all, it requires talent. Especially it requires young people who haven't learned yet what we don't know we can't do. So I'm really pleased that we've got corporate folks here talking to our students who really and truly do represent the way to create the future. I'm really interested to see how this new generation is going to continue to push railroads for us. So thank you all for being here. I hope everything works well. And Posse, again, thanks for your efforts.